A ship's docking with the S9, and among other things, it's carrying Bashir. One of the other things is a trill, and the lad's got lines, so let's do an early wheel, shall we? Trill Guy will be known to us as... Empok Norman Mormon, provided by Ensign Flinty. Empok Norman Mormon is here to meet Dax, but it's a little more complicated than that. He's a potential host, someone who's working his way through the bellyworm program to become joined like Dax is, and that means being assessed. This is potentially bad news for Norman, as Dax has a reputation for being a bit of an arsehole about it. If you'll recall, Jadzia herself was initially rejected by the previous host, Curzon. Understandable, then, that he's a bit apprehensive about the whole thing. There's no time like the present, thinks Bashir, and locates Dax for an introduction. She's in Quark's, having another after-hours game of Cardi Spin Cash, and cleaning everybody else out. Bashir makes himself scarce, whilst Dax tries to coax Empok Norman Mormon into joining the game, something Quark fully backs once he realises inexperience plus money equals profit. Norman's been on a long trip, though, and instead wants to rest, so Dax leaves with him, much to the frustration of everybody else. The following morning, he reports to Dax's quarters and is greeted by somebody entirely new. Dax was in the shower and comes to say goodbye to the new guy, who was apparently a wrestling partner. An early morning drink and insisting that Norman call her Jadzia completes an introduction that, I presume, is meant to throw him sufficiently off guard that she can see who he really is. Up in Ops, we have a rodent problem. Space voles have been an issue since the station was built, apparently, but hadn't bothered us till we expanded to using the furthest reaches where they were camped out. Curious that Kira didn't mention it while we had a chance of solving the problem while it was still contained, but I guess then we wouldn't have a subplot. Dax is introducing Empok Norman Mormon to everybody, though some of them in buttock form, and Cisco takes the chance to scare Norman some more about Dax's reputation with initiates. She takes the chance to point out that reputation was held by Curzon Dax, not her, before dragging out a stunned rodent and handing it to Norman. Next up is a trip through the wormhole, and one where he takes over the flight, as he's a higher-grade pilot. That gives us time for a chat, and they talk some more about how Curzon was a bit of a dick, and that Norman is Jadzia's first initiate, so it's kind of new to both of them. She's telling him about Curzon initially turning her down when their flight goes to shit. It would appear that even in open space we can't avoid hitting things, though at least Starfleet can't take the blame for this one, as Norman was at the stick. A little look shows us one of the Mega Shuttle's nacelles has gained a patch of blue, though we can't tell if it's a dent or a stain. Back on the station, O'Brien's trying to build a better space vole trap. He's talking to Kira about driving them out with noise when Quark arrives, our open door policy for the literal command center of the station apparently still in place. He's here to complain about a pest problem, and accidentally becomes the first test for O'Brien's solution, Ferengi hearing having a significantly wider range than humans. Bugger all of that, though, as Dax and Empok Norman Mormon are back through the wormhole and need a little help landing. Dax also wants to take a closer look at the blue wibbly they rammed, so we get a lab ready to do a science on it in the morning, while she takes Norman for dinner. It doesn't go particularly well. Klingon cuisine would appear to not be Norman's idea of tasty, and he's too timid to say otherwise. It's somewhat of a theme in his life, from the sounds of it. We learn he's only in the Initiate program because it was his father's desire, so much so that his dying wish was for Norman to not let him down. It isn't exactly a great reason to apply. In fact, it could be downright dangerous. If a host doesn't have sufficient drive and personality of their own, then the bellyworm can take over, and anybody who's watched Stargate knows how that turns out. O'Brien's looking for outside help with our space vole problem. Asking the former owners of the station sounds like a logical choice, until you remember that the military strongly opposed withdrawing, so it's not really a surprise when the cardigan he calls tells him to bollocks. While he looks for another answer, Cisco and Dax play chess and talk about Empok Norman Mormon. Dax is a little concerned about him, not just with his lack of direction, but she also thinks he's arrogant. The problem is this whole thing is a complicated topic for her. She doesn't want to be the arse that Curzon was, and still resents his recommendation that Jadzia be removed from the program. She believes she succeeded in spite of his actions. Cisco seems to think it's not that simple. Also not that simple is storing the blue wibbly Dax and Norman crashed into while they were in the Gamma Quadrant. Space voles care not for silly things like containment measures, and our blue wibbly takes the opportunity to wibble its little heart out. The following day, O'Brien finds the cause of the failure, some chewed lines. Knowing we can lose force fields around things is very bad indeed, especially when you remember how shit everybody is at using airlocks properly, so Sisko's declaring war on the space voles and wants them all murderized. They bugger off and leave Dax and Norman to try and figure out what's happening with the Blue Wibbly, during which Norman tries to backpedal on not having his own goals. Dax knows he's bullshitting though, because she went through something similar. She's thought about what Sisko said and has concluded that being blunt with Norman might be the best way to make him understand that merely wanting to be a host is, ironically, not enough to be a host. Talk of standards touches a nerve though, and Norman calls Jadzia an insult to the whole system and says Curzon was right to reject her, which is a curious conclusion when you consider how that turned out. In between the shouting, Dax was able to learn some stuff about the Blue Wibbly. Long story short, it's a universe. The problem is that it's having growth spurts, and as it does, it's replacing what was there to begin with. Obviously, this is going to be a problem. We already have a universe here, and frankly, redecorating an entire new one would be a lot of work. Also, we'd be dead. Sticking it back through the subspace what's-it that they rammed in the megashuttle is a problem for a few reasons, most of them very explosive. That leaves us with shoving a new force field round it, assuming the space voles let us, and this would technically solve the problem, which is to say that the Blue Wibbly would kaboom itself. We've a few hours before the next growth spurt, so that's how long Sisko has to decide if he wants to blow up a baby universe. Empok Norman Mormon has become Empok getting shit-faced in Quarks. He thinks he's ruined his life, and ever the comforting host, Quark basically agrees with him. Perhaps miserable people buy more drinks. While he gets wankered, Dax is doing more science to the Blue Wibbly. After she has an argument with the computer, which was all definitely important and not just technobollocks padding, she pays Sisko a call. He's all ready to murder a universe, but Dax says that might be a problem. She's had a closer look at the Blue Wibbly, and from what she can tell, it would appear to be inhabited. Kira wants to nuke them. To be fair to her, she argues that signs of life don't necessarily mean signs of intelligent life. Bashir, however, suggests the Blue Wibbly might be running at a different rate of time than us, giving any life ample time to evolve and develop. Based on this new data, Sisko's hesitant to pull the trigger, and instead allows the next phase of expansion while we all have a think. Kira believes he's making a mistake, and not just because the next jump will delete a whole area of the station. This is only going to get more difficult to solve the longer we leave it, and if the Blue Wibbly now holds a civilization or two, then, well, fuck 'em, we were here first. Odo's deeply opposed to the idea, considering it akin to mass murder, but nobody has any better ideas, so it's up to Sisko to choose whether or not to commit potential genocide. If this was Janeway, we'd already be rolling the credits. Perhaps a reminder that he has a son will sway him, so let's put one of those in the script. Jake's in love and spills his guts after convincing himself that his dad has already learned about it from someone else. He's worried that his dad will balk at learning she works on a Darbo table, and it appears that concern is well-founded. He gets over the shock and recovers well enough, but his initial reaction is still disappointing. Jake doesn't say whether the object of his affections actually reciprocates, but wants to invite her to dinner anyway. Tonight's probably not a good choice, what with the potential end of the universe and all, so Sisko suggests another time. Right, that's enough of that. Let's deal with Empok Norman Mormon. Dax tracks him down to Quarks, where he's still drinking, so you've at least got to admire his endurance. He's assuming the worst, that she's here to make his rejection official, and is surprised when it doesn't come. Instead, she gives a speech about how Jadzia was very much like him, an overachiever with no understanding of the universe at large or her place in it. Curzon Dax tore her apart before recommending she be rejected, and that failure made her redouble her efforts. She was approved as a result, and it was Jadzia who asked specifically for Dax when she found out that Curzon was dying. And maybe that aspect of Curzon Dax was more Dax than Curzon, as she's found herself needing to perform a similar intervention for him. The understanding that he hasn't been shit-canned, at least not yet, seems to dawn on him. Dax clarifies that she doesn't know if he should be, mostly because he doesn't really know himself, and that's something he needs to resolve. It'll have to wait, as Sisko's here and he's made a decision. He wants Dax to fly our Blue Wibbly back to the Gamma Quadrant and try to cram it into the subspace pothole they hit. That's very bloody dangerous indeed, which is why it might be useful to have Norman along. At least he won't have to worry about his future if it all goes wrong. We teleport the blue Wibbly over to a mega shuttle, and we'll assume the technical issues are why we didn't just keep it in the transport buffer where it'd be safe. To the wormhole we go, where we're told flying through a something or other makes our Wibbly more inclined to kaboom. We're hitting a few too many, and Norman thinks we're going to fail, so a pep talk from Dax, where she points out that the alternative is death anyway, makes him decide to have another try. He makes it, despite a few brown trousers moments, and we stick the blue Wibbly back in the pothole we found. Maybe it worked, maybe it didn't. I guess the next ship to try and go through the wormhole will find out. Dax and Norman don't care though, as it's no longer their problem. Back to the station they go for a little heart-to-heart, and one where Norman apologises for calling Dax a worthless arsehole. The reality of joining isn't the end goal he expected. Maybe that's helped him see why being a host is for him, or maybe it's broken the spell entirely. He doesn't tell us his decision, only that he's made one. He departs the station on good terms with Dax, so we'll leave her to consider what her actions with Norman mean for who she is, until the next adventure. You get desires that scare you, dreams that used to belong to someone else. A stew of impulses from people you never met, urges to try things you've never tried but have 1,000 memories of. It's a fascinating insight into the melange of psyches within a joined trill, aspects of former personalities without them being distinct entities in their own right. The behaviours that Norman considers to be unbecoming of a joined trill are the very things that Dax brought to Jadzia. Whether those desires could really be classified as desire rather than influence is a question to ponder, but it's not the only one. What are the conflicts that could arise from this? Vivid images of eating 100 steaks, but the taste buds of the current host make them inedible. Remembering your favourite piece of music, but these new ears are more acute and pick up the minor flaws. The initial transfer period must be a minefield of little disappointments, but also the opportunity to retry all the things you've experienced before and didn't like. I've said previously that Trill interest me greatly, and it's things like this that are the reason why. There's more than a little crossover with Doctor Who, and number 10 provides perhaps the best summary with the line, "New teeth, that's weird." A whole concept explained in 4 words. There are other points of interest regarding the Trill in this one, the flaws inherent in the Initiate program being one. The whole thing has attained a mythical status, intentional or not, and people within the system clearly see the process as a challenge to compete in. But you could argue that's directly opposed to what the program is actually looking for. Receiving a symbiont isn't the reward. The accumulated knowledge, wisdom, and perspective of multiple lifetimes is not a goal. It's the means to better achieve your own goals, a toolbox to draw from that makes you more equipped to tackle what comes next. That's what Norman doesn't have, a desire beyond joining. But could he really be blamed for that when such focus has been placed on the importance of becoming a host? Tangentially, I wonder if that system was set up to ensure that a symbiont is never allowed to stagnate, to wallow in their own achievements, rather than strive for more. Extend the thought further, and we touch again on a concept we theorized here before, that perhaps the system is designed to prevent the rise of despots, symbionts who would choose the weakest-willed hosts in order to continue the same reign of power. A system that allows only hosts capable of exerting control would be a pretty good way of keeping that in check. The last Trill point here is Jadzia Dax referring to Jadzia in the third person when discussing her interactions with Curzon Dax, though also slipping into referring to her as I when talking about requesting the Dax bellyworm. That could just be slightly clumsy writing, but let's assume it isn't. That leaves us with it being either an unintentional mixture on Dax's part, a nod to the element of blending in her head, or the possibility that she sees a division between Jadzia before Curzon's rejection and the one after. That would fit with how she describes Jadzia's actions in reapplying. Is it possible she sees that as a kind of rebirth, the true start of the person who would become a host, and the one with whom she feels the greatest affinity? Let's have a couple of other points before we end then. I doubt I'm alone in being disappointed that there was no real exploration of how Sisko grapples with the prospect of genocide, even in self-defense, based on his history with the Borg. The original writer is certainly on record in this regard. Whilst I think the Trill stuff had more potential and it was right to focus on it, that could have been done during any threat of the week. Using the baby universe here as a subplot rather than saving it for its own episode feels like a waste of potential for examining Sisko's character. Lastly, the flute from Bashir was a nice touch. That he's comfortable enough now to make a joke tells us quite a lot about how he and O'Brien are getting on between episodes, and its inclusion here is yet another example of how small incidental details can tell us more about the things that the writers simply didn't have time to show us. End of episode.
I promise you that there's nothing different. It's all absolutely 100% correct.
Yeah, you're probably right. I just can't remember a time when me gach has been served with a side dish of potato dauphinoise.
You're getting paranoid again. Calm down and think it through.
It's just, I can't get it out my head now. It feels like there's something not quite right and I can't put my finger on it. Well, claw, you know, 'cause I'm a dog. Anyway, I'm sure it'll come to me eventually.
I swear to you I've checked the history database, and everything's completely normal throughout the entire Federation de Planets Uni. Low woof.